There's a fundamental lie embedded in your subconscious from the moment you stepped into your first classroom. An untruth repeated so often by news anchors, economists in sharp suits, and politicians with easy smiles that it has become indistinguishable from reality itself. The lie is that history is a straight line of progress, that we are living at the peak of civilization, and that the money you carry in your wallet or see glowing on your banking app is actually yours. They told you the Great Depression of 1929 was an accident, a hiccup in the system, and that the wise men running our financial institutions learned their lesson and created mechanisms to protect you. But look around. Take a deep breath and look at the reality of your life, not the numbers, but the substance. If progress is constant, why could your grandfather, with a high school diploma and a mid-level blue-collar job, support a wife, 3 children, buy a home, drive a new car every 3 years, and still save for retirement, all on a single salary? And why do you, likely with higher qualifications and perhaps 2 incomes in your household, feel like you are running on a treadmill that accelerates every day, where the dream of home ownership has mutated into a nightmare of 35 years of bank debt, and retirement looks like a mirage dissolving on the horizon? The cognitive dissonance you feel, that subtle nausea when you open your bills at the end of the month, is not a product of your imagination. It is the symptom of a crime, a silent, slow, mathematically perfect crime, perpetrated not by bank robbers with masks and guns, but by bureaucrats with pens and legislation. To understand what they have done to your future, we must tear back the veil of time and look back, not with the foolish nostalgia of romantics, but with the surgical coldness of a coroner examining a corpse. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and the rhyme we are hearing now is the same one that echoed in the marble halls of ancient Rome just before the collapse, the same that sounded in the ports of the Spanish Empire when American gold destroyed their economy, and the same that brought the British Empire to its knees. In every case, the mechanism of destruction was identical: currency debasement. When Rome was at its peak, the denarius was a coin of pure silver, a symbol of honest exchange. A day's labor was worth a denarius, and that denarius bought a specific amount of wheat or wine. But the emperors, thirsty for war, bread, and circuses to appease the mob and maintain power, realized they lacked the silver to cover their exorbitant spending. Their solution? They began to collect the coins, melt them down, and mix in base metals like copper or bronze. Suddenly, with the same amount of silver, they minted 2, 3, 10 coins. The emperor's face remained. The name of the coin was the same, but the intrinsic value, the soul of the money, had been stolen. The Roman citizen received his pay and felt the weight of the coin, but when he went to the market, the merchant, knowing this was rotten money, raised the price of wheat. They called it scarcity, we call it inflation. But the technical name, the real name, is theft. And what we are living through today is the digital, sophisticated, globalized version of this same cheap parlor trick. This brings us to the first crucial point of our investigation: the illusion of the rising number. You suffer from an induced visual disorder where the number stamped on your paycheck looks larger than your grandfather's, creating the false sensation that you earn more. In 1950, an annual salary of $3,500 in the United States was a passport to the upper middle class. Today, if you earn $50,000, you can barely pay rent in a metropolis and keep the fridge stocked with quality food. The paradox is brutal. You have more money in nominal terms, more notes, more zeros in the account, but your quality of life, your real power to command the world's resources, has collapsed. The system has convinced you that rising prices are a natural phenomenon, like the tide coming in or rain falling, something inevitable. But price is merely the exchange ratio between money and product. If technology advances, if machines make production more efficient, if logistics improve, prices should, by the logic of the free market, fall. Everything should get cheaper over time. Computers get cheaper, televisions get cheaper. Why do food, housing, energy, and land get more expensive? Because the denominator of that equation, the currency, is being destroyed faster than technology can cheapen goods. You are not getting richer when you receive a 5% raise after 10% real inflation. You are being pushed down the social ladder while applauding the system that cut the rungs. This disconnection between price and value is the first layer of the great fraud, the anesthesia that prevents the population from revolting while their wealth is drained drop by drop. But who started this? Who designed the architecture of this invisible prison? To find the culprits, we must travel to a cold night in November 1910 at a train station in New Jersey. A private rail car, with curtains drawn, carried a group of men representing, at the time, a quarter of the world's total wealth. Among them were representatives of the banking empires of J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and the Warburgs of Europe. Their destination was Jekyll Island, an isolated island off the coast of Georgia, an exclusive hunting club for the elite. For 9 days, these men conspired in absolute secrecy, so secret they used only first names to address each other, fearing servants would hear their surnames and the press would find out. The goal of that meeting was not the welfare of the American people or global economic stability. The goal was to create a private banking cartel that held a monopoly on currency issuance but appeared in the public eye to be a government agency. There, the blueprint was born for what would become the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank, officially instituted in 1913. It is imperative that you understand the gravity of 1913. Before this date, banks could fail if they were irresponsible. If they lent money they didn't have, they collapsed. There was a real risk to greed. The Jekyll Island cartel wanted to remove that risk. They created a lender of last resort, an entity capable of creating liquidity out of thin air to bail out banks from their own bad bets, transferring the cost to society. They named it federal to give it the air of the state, and reserve to suggest security, but it is not federal. It is a private corporation with secret shareholders, and it has no reserves, only the capacity to print debt. The Federal Reserve does not create money, it creates debt. Every dollar that enters circulation is loaned to the government or banks with interest attached. Think about that for a second. If all money in circulation is created as interest-bearing debt, and the money to pay the interest has not yet been created, the total debt is mathematically unpayable. The system was designed to be a perpetual hamster wheel, where society must go deeper into debt just to pay the interest on previous debt. 1913 marked the beginning of modern slavery, where iron chains were replaced by unbreakable financial obligations. It was the year the economic sovereignty of the individual was sold to guarantee the profit of a banking oligopoly. Yet, even with the Federal Reserve operating, there was an annoying obstacle for these architects of chaos: gold. The dollar still had a link, however tenuous, to the yellow metal. Gold is honest. It cannot be printed. It requires effort to extract. It is finite. As long as the dollar was a promise of payment in gold, there was a physical limit to how much the government and banks could steal. They could not print money infinitely because eventually someone would knock on the Treasury's door demanding the corresponding gold. This limit was tolerated during the World Wars and Reconstruction, but by the 1960s, the American government's spending spree with the Vietnam War and Great Society social programs created an unsustainable hole. Foreign nations, led by France, realized the United States was printing far more dollars than it had gold in its vaults, and they started asking for their gold back. French ships crossed the Atlantic loaded with green-painted paper and returned loaded with gold bars. The vault was emptying. The scheme was about to be exposed. That was when the final blow struck, the coup de grace to monetary honesty, Sunday, August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon interrupted television programming, interrupting the popular series Bonanza, to make an announcement that would change human history more profoundly than many wars. With a serious demeanor, he announced the temporary closure of the gold window. He said the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold. The keyword used was temporary. In politics, there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government measure. In that exact second, the dollar ceased to be a certificate of value, a check representing something real, and became fiat currency, from the Latin let it be done, value by decree. Value based only on the faith that the government will not collapse in the military force that compels the use of that currency. The consequences of 1971 were catastrophic, but subtle at first. It was like releasing the handbrake of a car parked on a gentle slope. Initially, the movement is imperceptible, but gravity is relentless. By breaking the anchor to gold, the government gained the divine power to create money without limits. And this brings us to one of the most perverse and least understood concepts in economics, the Cantillon Effect. Richard Cantillon was an 18th century banker and economist who understood a fundamental truth: money is not neutral. When the government prints $1 trillion, that money doesn't magically appear in every citizen's account at the same time, equally. If it did, there would be no real effect. We would just add a zero to all notes and prices, and nothing would change. But that is not how it works. Money enters the economy at specific points. Imagine new money like honey being poured onto a pyramid of champagne glasses. Who is at the top of the pyramid? The government, the large commercial banks, corporations linked to the state, and the military-industrial complex. They receive this newly printed money first. And here is the secret. They receive the money at its old value, the full value, before inflation occurs. They use this cheap money to buy real assets, stocks, real estate, land, commodities. They buy companies, execute mergers, expand their empires. When they spend this money, it begins to circulate to the next layer, the suppliers, the luxury services, the secondary financial market. As the money flows down the pyramid, it loses value. Why? Because now there's more money chasing the same amount of goods. Prices begin to rise. When that money finally reaches the base of the pyramid, where you, the salaried worker, the small business owner, the retiree, are waiting, it is already diluted. It is worth almost nothing. But prices at the supermarket, the gas station, and the housing market have already risen because the elite at the top of the pyramid already use the new money to inflate those assets. The Cantillon Effect is, therefore, a wealth transfer mechanism. It sucks purchasing power from the base, from those who work for money and save it, and transfers it to the top, to those with access to the printer and easy credit. It is no accident that social inequality exploded exponentially after 1971. It is not the fault of savage capitalism in the free market sense. It is the fault of monetary socialism for the rich, funded by the destruction of the poor's currency. The system was designed so that those close to the printer get rich without producing anything, while those far from the printer work harder and harder to buy less and less. It is an invisible caste system, where your position is not determined by your blood, but by your proximity to the source of fake money. And how do they hide this? How do they prevent the population from marching with torches and pitchforks to the headquarters of central banks? They use semantics as a weapon. They redefined the word inflation. Originally, in classical economics manuals, inflation meant an increase in the money supply, inflating the quantity of money. The rise in prices was the consequence, the symptom. But they changed the definition in dictionaries and the media. Now, they say inflation is the rise in prices. Why does this change matter? Because if inflation is the rise in prices, the blame can be shifted to the greedy supermarket owner, the war in Ukraine, the drought, the virus, the supply chain. The blame lies with anyone except the one printing the money. By focusing on the symptom, price, and not the cause, monetary expansion, they divert attention from the true culprit. But the naked, raw truth is that inflation is a tax, and it is the worst kind of tax, because it is invisible and requires no approval from Congress or Parliament. Think with me. If the government wanted to tax you 20% directly, ripping that money explicitly from your paycheck, there would be a revolt. You would see the money leaving. But if they print money to pay their debts, they are diluting the value of the bills in your pocket. If there were 100 units of money in the economy and you held one, you owned 1% of the economy. If they print another 100 units, now there are 200, and your unit is worth only 0.5%. They stole half your wealth without touching your wallet. It is a stealth confiscation. They use inflation to pay unpayable debts. They spend what they don't have, promise what they can't keep, and pay the bill by devaluing the money you sweated to earn. It is taxation without representation in its purest and most perverse form. This inflationary tax destroys something sacred in society, the ability to plan for the future. When currency constantly loses value, saving becomes a mathematical error. And here we enter even darker territory, where prudence is punished and recklessness is rewarded. You were taught to save, right? Save for a rainy day, the saying went. But in a post-1971 fiat system, keeping money in the bank ensures you will get poorer. Let's look at the real numbers, not the ones on the evening news. If your bank pays you 5% interest a year on savings, but real inflation, the inflation of the assets you want to buy, like real estate, quality education, healthcare, is 10 or 15%, you are losing purchasing power every year. The real interest rate is negative. The bank is using your money, lending it at higher rates, and returning crumbs that buy less than what you originally deposited. This forces society into speculative, anxious behavior. You cannot simply work and save. You are forced to become an investor, a speculator, just to try and maintain the value of what you earned. You are pushed into the stock market, into hedge funds, into volatile cryptocurrencies, not because you want to take risks, but because the alternative, staying in safe cash, is the certainty of a slow bleed. They transform the economy into a casino where you are forced to play. And the house, the banking system, always wins the fees, regardless of whether you win or lose. But the manipulation doesn't stop there. To maintain the illusion that everything is under control, that inflation is within target, governments created one of the most sophisticated tools of mass deception. Official inflation indices, like the CPI. Have you noticed the official index says inflation was 4%, but when you go to the grocery store, your bill is up 20%? Do you think that's just a feeling? No, it is statistical engineering. Over the decades, they have changed how they calculate inflation repeatedly. They use methodological tricks. One is substitution. The logic is this. If the price of steak rises too much, the government assumes you will stop eating steak and start eating chicken. So they remove steak from the calculation basket and insert chicken. If chicken goes up, they assume you'll eat eggs. The inflation index doesn't measure the cost of maintaining the same standard of living. It measures the cost of a declining standard of living. They mask the loss of your quality of life by adjusting the basket to reflect your growing poverty. Another trick is hedonic adjustment. If the price of a new car rises 10%, but the government decides the new model has technological improvements worth 10%, they register inflation as 0. On paper, the price didn't rise. In reality, you need to shell out 10% more to buy the car. These indices are manufactured to be low. Why? Because many government payments, like pensions and social benefits, are indexed to inflation. If they admitted real inflation, the government would go bankrupt in months. Furthermore, keeping the index low keeps interest rates artificially low and sustains the illusion of GDP growth. If we discounted real inflation from announced GDP growth, we would see we have been in recession or stagnation for decades. The economic growth they celebrate is, in large part, just inflation disguised as productivity. It is the growth of a tumor, not a muscle. Now stop and think about the magnitude of what has been exposed so far. We are not talking about political incompetence. We are talking about a system meticulously designed to extract wealth. The creation of the Fed in 1913 provided the weapon. The end of the gold standard in 1971 provided the infinite ammunition. The Cantillon Effect is the finger on the trigger aiming the shot at the middle class, and manipulated official inflation is the smokescreen hiding the body. You didn't lose the game because you played poorly. You lost because the rules were rewritten while you played, and the scoreboard was tampered with by the stadium owners. But if you think the destruction of savings and inflationary theft are the end of the story, you are mistaken. That is merely preparing the ground. The true coup, the real trap that keeps you awake at night and prevents nations from rising, is something even more insidious. It is the transformation of the free citizen into a debt serf, a feudal concept repackaged for the 21st century, where physical chains are no longer used, but rather credit scores and compound interest. They created a world where debt is not an option, but a biological necessity for economic survival. And what happens when the debt becomes unpayable, not just for you, but for the government issuing the currency itself? What happens when mathematics, which accepts no bribes and hears no political speeches, finally knocks on the door to collect the final bill? History shows us that fiat currencies have a life cycle. They are born, abused, lose value, and die. The average lifespan of a back-end currency is 27 years. The dollar has been in this state since 1971. We are living on borrowed time in the twilight of a global monetary cycle. The signs of rupture are everywhere, in the cracks of the banking system, in the insane volatility of markets, in the silent hopelessness of younger generations. We are approaching the moment of impact, the point of no return where trust, the only thing holding up this house of cards, evaporates. And when that happens, the wealth transfer we've seen so far will look like child's play compared to what is coming. Because when currency dies, he who holds real assets becomes king, and he who holds paper becomes a pauper. But to understand how to protect yourself from the impending collapse, you must first understand the final engineering of the trap. How they use debt to ensure you never, ever crawl out of the hole on your own. The modern debt trap is not a bump in the road, nor the result of individual financial mismanagement. It is the operating system of the post-1971 world. Understand this, and you will understand why, despite working more hours than a medieval peasant, you feel prosperity slipping through your fingers. The banking system, in collusion with the state, created a reality where debt ceased to be a shame or an emergency resource to become a mandatory lifestyle. Think of home ownership. In the 50s, a family saved for a few years and bought a house, often with cash or a short mortgage of 5 or 10 years. Today, we have normalized the aberration of signing a 35-year contract. 35 years. That is half a healthy human adult life. You're not buying a house. You're renting money from the bank for 3.5 decades, paying for 2 or 3 houses in the process, just to have the right to sleep under a roof the government can tax perpetually. They call it a dream, but mathematically, it is serfdom. And the most perverse part is that this debt is necessary to keep the currency alive. Since money is created as debt, if everyone paid off their debts tomorrow, money would vanish from circulation. The system needs you to be in debt. It needs you chasing the next payment, anxious, docile, and productive, generating taxes and interest. It is perfect social engineering. Chains made of mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. And this brings us to the proof of the crime. The body of evidence they try to hide with complex statistics and optimistic speeches. The historical comparison of purchasing power. Let's leave the charts aside and look at tangible reality, at the physical world. In 1913, the fateful year of the Federal Reserve's creation, $20 corresponded to a 1-ounce gold coin, the double eagle. With that single coin, a man could walk into a luxury department store and buy a custom-made suit of the finest wool, a silk shirt, a pair of genuine leather shoes, and still have change for an exquisite dinner for 2. Today, what do you do with a $20 paper bill? You can barely buy a pair of synthetic socks and a quick snack of dubious quality. The paper has turned to trash. But here's the secret they don't want you to notice. If you had kept that gold coin from 1913 and took it to a store today, its value in current currency would be approximately $2,500. With that value, you can still buy the tailored suit, the shirt, the shoes, and pay for the dinner. The gold kept its value. The gold didn't change. The suit didn't change. What changed, what melted like ice in the sun, was the dollar. The paper has lost 98% of its purchasing capacity. This is not a market fluctuation. It is the systematic theft of 98% of the work effort of entire generations. When you keep money in the bank, you're storing ice in the desert. They convinced you the ice is solid while they turn up the thermostat. This melting is not linear. It is exponential. And this is where we enter endgame territory for fiat currency. History is ruthless and plays no favorites. It teaches us that no fiduciary currency, without backing, has survived forever. The Roman denarius died. The assignats of the French Revolution became wallpaper. The Weimar German mark was swept from the gutters. The Zimbabwean dollar, the Venezuelan bolivar. The list is a graveyard of bureaucratic arrogance. They all follow the same biological cycle: birth, promise of stability; youth, moderate expansion; maturity, abuse of the printer to fund wars and populism; and death, hyperinflation, and repudiation. The US dollar, and by extension all global currencies pegged to it, is in a terminal stage. The symptoms are screaming for those with ears to hear: extreme volatility, social polarization, public debt growing by trillions every few months, numbers the human brain can't even process, and the total loss of trust in institutions. The collapse of a global reserve currency doesn't happen overnight, like in a Hollywood movie. It is a process, not an event. It is like the bankruptcy described by Hemingway. Gradually, then suddenly. We are in the gradually phase. Eastern countries are accumulating gold at record rates, creating parallel payment systems, fleeing the dollar as if it were a plague. They know the music is stopping. They know the United States used the privilege of the dollar as a geopolitical weapon, confiscating reserves and imposing sanctions, which broke the basic rule of money: neutrality. When money becomes a political weapon, it ceases to be a reliable medium of exchange and becomes a risk. The world is de-dollarizing silently. And when the critical mass of rejection is reached, the suddenly will arrive. And what will this suddenly look like? Do not expect to necessarily see wheelbarrows full of cash in Times Square tomorrow. The modern collapse may take the form of digital capital controls, rationing, the forced implementation of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, that program where and when you can spend, persistent double-digit inflation that devours the middle class until it becomes dependent on state aid to eat. The end game is the consolidation of power. If money dies, who has power? Those who hold real assets, those who hold land, energy, food, gold, productive capacity, and technological sovereignty. The great wealth transfer we spoke of at the beginning is exactly this: the final passage of real assets from the hands of indebted families and bankrupt small business owners to the balance sheets of giant conglomerates and the omnipotent state. Faced with this Dantesque scenario, despair is the reaction of the ignorant. Knowledge, on the other hand, is the basis of strategic action. If you have understood that paper money is a broken promise, you are already ahead of 99% of the population. The solution is not to try to win in their casino, speculating on binary options or believing in the next meme coin. The solution is to leave the casino. It is to build your own ark before the flood. This means converting, systematically, the fruit of your labor, which they pay in depreciating paper, into assets that cannot be printed. We are talking about hard assets, physical gold and silver, which do not depend on electricity or banking counterparties to exist. Productive land, far from major urban centers, where you can ensure the basics of survival. Education and practical skills that solve real problems. A plumber or surgeon will always have value, regardless of the prevailing currency, while an investment bank spreadsheet analyst can become obsolete overnight. And for those who understand technology, Bitcoin is a censorship-resistant digital store of value outside the traditional banking system, a way to transport wealth across space and time without permission from any king or president. But the greatest preparation is mental. You must kill the naive consumer living inside you and give birth to the sovereign producer. The system wants you weak, dependent, obese on cheap entertainment, and indebted up to your neck. The ultimate rebellion is to be strong, healthy, solvent, and master of your own mind. The great wealth transfer will happen. That is a mathematical certainty. The only variable is your position in that equation. Will you be the victim holding the paper while it burns? Or will you be the strategist holding the real resources when the smoke clears? The collapse of fiat currency is not the end of the world. It is the end of a world. It is the end of the era of illusion and the return to hard reality where value must be real to be recognized. For the prepared man, chaos is not an abyss. It is a ladder. The greatest fortunes in history were not made in times of calm, but during paradigm shifts. Rome fell, but life went on. The feudal system fell, and the Renaissance emerged. The current system is falling. The question you must ask yourself when you lay your head on the pillow tonight is not, how will I pay the next bill? But rather, what do I own that is real? Because when the music stops, and it will stop, Only what is real will remain standing. The master file is open. The truth has been spoken. Now the move is yours.